Hello, Safe Harbor. Pastor Rich here for another 12-minute mark. If I were to ask you, what do you think is the most controversial thing that Jesus ever said in his teaching? I'd love to hear your response. You can comment on that, send us something to let us know, text us, email us, and say, well, I believe that the most controversial thing that Jesus ever said was, and then you would get to fill in that blank. Today we're going to cover what I believe was, in his time, the most controversial thing that Jesus could have said. And it probably isn't something we even notice much today. But, you know, to really appreciate and understand a lot of what Jesus was saying, you have to understand Jesus in Jesus's time, in his audience, in his culture and tradition. That's when a lot of things are revealed, that, you know, there's certain things that shock us that to them it would have been no big deal. And then there are things that would have shocked them that to us are no big deal. And I think today we'll really see one of those come through. So we're beginning in chapter 7 as we're moving along. We've just covered in our last time Jesus walking on the water and all the people coming and being healed. And so again, the backdrop is nothing but good things seem to be happening. And it's been a couple chapters since we've seen the Pharisees, because Jesus went off to Gentile lands for a while, but now he's back. And so, in starting in chapter 7, and one day, Jesus and a crowd was sitting there, and some of the Pharisees came from Jerusalem and noticed that Jesus was eating, and they were all eating with ceremonially unclean hands, ceremonially unwashed. The Jews, especially the Pharisees, they don't eat anything without going through the ceremonial washings anytime they go to the marketplace and bring anything back. It's an ancient tradition they hold, and they wash cups, pitchers, kettles, etc. Because of their ancient traditions. So, the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked him, why do your disciples not follow the traditions of the elders? Instead, they're eating their food with unclean hands. And Jesus replied, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are but rules taught by men. You have a fine way of setting aside the law of God to observe the traditions you've handed down. For instance, Moses said, honor your father and mother. And anyone who speaks evil of his father and mother should be put to death. But you say, whatever one would have given to their father and mother is korban. Korban is a gift devoted to God. Then you don't let them do anything for their father and mother. Thus you nullify the word of God by the traditions you've handed down. And you do many things like this. Then Jesus called the crowd to him and said, listen, every one of you, hear this. Nothing can make you unclean by going into you. It is what comes out of you that makes you unclean. Well, when Jesus went back into the house, the disciples followed him and asked him what he was talking about. And he said, you all still don't get it? Can't you see that what you eat doesn't go into the heart, but just into the stomach and then out the body? It's what comes from the body, what comes from you, that makes you unclean. Because it doesn't go into the heart, but what comes out of you comes from the heart. And then he said, it's those thoughts, the thought life, that defiles you. And in saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. He said you're unclean by evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, greed, wickedness, deceit, lust, slander, pride, and foolishness. These They come from the heart, and they make you unclean. All right, we'll stop there. That puts us to verse 23, about half of chapter 7. And maybe you saw it, the most controversial thing that Jesus could have said. And it wasn't calling the Pharisees hypocrites. Again, Mark is written primarily to Greek-speaking Gentiles. That's primarily the audience to his letter. And so this is another example where Mark is recounting the story of the Pharisees and explaining the traditions of the Jews, of the Pharisees, because so many of the people that Mark is writing for are Gentiles who don't know all the traditions. And so there's the little parenthetical reference of the Jews. They have all these cleanliness laws, and they take care of all that, and explaining what Korban is and all that. But you can imagine they're just sitting there having lunch, and the Pharisees have all these traditions of ceremonial washings, and there's groups of Jews today that still observe these, but Jesus has no use for them, and he goes back to the Old Testament. Notice that Jesus completely bypasses the question. He doesn't really answer so much in giving a reason. He goes to the authority of the prophet Isaiah and says, you have a fine way of bypassing what the prophets have said to establish and maintain your own traditions, which separate them out as a special little group. And honor me with their lips, their hearts are far from me. They're saying all the right things. They're still very religious, but the heart isn't there. And he gives one concrete example. Again, he goes from quoting the prophet Isaiah, then going all the way back to Moses. So Jesus is really using the Bible here against them to say, honor your father and mother. Now, I know that probably when you were a kid, your parents quoted that great command to you. The commandment, honor your father and mother. Typically referring to children obeying their parents. We have other verses on children obeying their parents. This particular commandment has almost always, throughout history of the Hebrew people, been understood as grown children taking care of their elderly parents, providing for them. Of course, there's no Social Security, there's no IRAs, there's no 401ks at this time, and it was the job to take care of aged parents. That was the intent of this command and the way it had always been interpreted, and so Jesus interprets it that way. And so we have from the mouth of Jesus, he's interpreting it that way. And he says, you've come up with a tradition called Korban, an Aramaic word, devoted to God, meaning that, I'm going to do something else with this money, set it aside in a way to keep them from caring for their parents. So that's one example. And, when Jesus says, it's not what goes into you, but what comes out of you, that just jives with the way we typically think, right? We typically recognize hypocrisy as that which simply goes through the motions, or that which has no heart behind it, that which says one thing and does another. But what Jesus does here is, they ask a question about the cleanliness, about the ceremonial cleanliness. The Pharisees aren't talking about what they're eating. They're eating kosher, clean foods. We know that's what they're eating. And Jesus goes one step further, not only to their hypocrisy of the cleanliness, but he then rewrites the food law codes from the Old Testament. This is huge. It's the most controversial thing that he says, and his disciples are blown away by it. They don't even get it. They ask him about it after they go into the house. And, we see this even in Acts chapter 10, well after the crucifixion, the resurrection, the sheet of unclean animals comes down to Peter, and the Lord says, get up and eat. And Peter says, hey, I've never eaten anything unclean in my life. And so we know that his disciples, they're still following the Old Testament food codes, because That's the whole second half of Exodus, I believe it is, where they're telling them what foods they can eat, what they can't eat. When you and I eat, and maybe you're eating a barbecue sandwich, and you might have that sandwich half gone before you say, "Oh, is this chicken or pork?" Well, the Jew would never say that. They would, they wouldn't touch the pork. They would do all they can to stay away from that. That would be an unclean food to them. And Jesus here, it says in Mark's reference, he says, when Jesus said this, he made all food clean. That is huge. That we just take that for granted today. But even his chief apostle Peter, years later, wouldn't enter into this. We're very thankful. I'm very thankful for that we don't have to worry about the cleanliness of things that we eat. So it's just a massive lightning bolt to them that all food now is clean. And so we know that Jesus fulfilled the moral law by living a perfect life. And here we see that just like he overran some of the understanding of the Sabbath laws before when he said he was Lord of the Sabbath, and now he's kind of Lord of the banquet, the great banquet table, saying everything is clean for you to eat here. And that is probably as controversial in his day of anything he could have said. And then he goes to talk about what does make you unclean. And we have those lists there. The evil thoughts, sexual immorality, adultery, lust, those kind of go together in terms of breaking your marriage covenant. And then, the greed, murder, deceit, slander. These are all kind of relational things and personal character, relational type things. You notice in that list, that moral code list that Jesus gives, there's nothing in there that's really what we would call ceremonial. These are just basic, kind of the character you're made of and how you treat others. And so Jesus drops the major bomb, all food being clean. We're thankful for that. And now we see he has surpassed the law of Moses in putting that together. Well, that puts us at 12 minutes. We will finish chapter 7 next time. God bless you.